The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as much a part of a Midwestern summer as the buzz of cicadas in the oak trees. It was the summer of '72, and the air in Henderson County was thick with humidity and the sweet, heavy smell of money. Grain prices were climbing higher than anyone had ever seen, and farmers were spending like they'd never have to see a lean year again. Shiny new green and red tractors lined the gravel driveway of the old McGregor place, their paint still glistening. But that wasn't what I was here for. My name is Jedediah Stone, and back then I was just a young man trying to hold on to the 320 acres my father had left me. Dad's rules were simple and seared into my soul. Owe no man. Fix what's broken, and never ever bet the farm on the weather or the government. While my neighbors were lining up to sign papers with the Farm Credit Bank for brand new John Deere 4630s with air-conditioned cabs, I was walking toward the back of the auction lot, where the real iron was rusting in the tall grass. That's where I saw it. Tucked behind a dilapidated hay rake and a set of worn-out disc harrows was an Alice Chalmers HD6 bulldozer. She was a sorry sight. The iconic Persian orange paint was faded to a pale, chalky salmon, flaking off in sheets to reveal patches of deep rust. The tracks were loose and sagged into the mud. One of the big blade lift cylinders was weeping a dark trail of hydraulic fluid down its chrome rod, and a family of sparrows had made a home in the exhaust stack. She wasn't big by today's standards, but back then her 10 tons of solid American steel were a formidable thing. I climbed up onto the track, my work boots crunching on the gritty metal. The operator's seat was torn, the stuffing spilling out like guts. The levers were stiff with rust, the floor plates caked with a half-inch of hardened grease and dirt. I pulled the dipstick on the engine. The oil was black as tar, but it was there. I knew the heart of this beast was the Alice Chalmers 6000 series diesel, a direct-injection 6-cylinder engine that was known for being as stubborn as it was reliable. They were noisy, they were smoky, but they were tough. Looking at that old relic, Stone. The voice was smooth, confident and dripping with condescension. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Richard Miller. Rich, as everyone called him, had inherited the farm next to mine about the same time I took over ours. But where my father preached caution, his had preached leverage. Rich was the poster boy for the new way of farming. He'd been the first in the county to buy a brand new International Harvester 1066 with the white Deluxe cab, and he never missed a chance to talk about its turbocharger or how many more acres he could plow in a day than my old Farmall M. I turned slowly. He was leaning against the fender of a shiny new Ford pickup, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. He was clean, his jeans creased, his shirt unstained. I probably had more grease under my fingernails than he'd seen in his life. "Just looking, Rich," I said, my voice flat. "That thing belongs in a scrapyard," he said with a laugh, gesturing at the Dozer. "Probably get a couple $100 for it by the pound. Old man McGregor should have hauled it off years ago. It's an embarrassment." I ignored him and continued my inspection, running my hand over the cold, pitted steel of the blade. It was a straight blade, no fancy angles or tilts, but it was thick. I could see where McGregor had welded new cutting edges on it over the years. This machine had worked. It had a history etched into its steel. The auctioneer was moving closer, selling off the small stuff now. I heard a set of post-hole diggers go for a price that would have bought them new 5 years earlier. The fever was catching. "You're not actually thinking of bidding on that junker, are you?" Rich pressed, walking closer. "Jed, a man can't make a living with yesterday's tools. The bank in town is handing out money. I just got approved for another quarter section. Going to need a bigger planter next spring, maybe a 12-row. "Good for you, Rich," I said, my eyes still on the Dozer. "I'm serious," he said, lowering his voice as if he were giving me a sacred piece of advice. "You're stuck in the past. Your dad, bless his heart, he was a good man, but his ways don't work anymore. You've got to expand. Get bigger or get out. That's the name of the game now." The auctioneer finally arrived at our corner of the lot. "All right, folks, what we have here is an old Alice Chalmers Dozer. As is, where is. Doesn't run, been sitting a while. We're selling it for scrap value. Who'll give me $100 to start it?" $100. Silence. The crowd looked at the heap of orange steel and then at each other, some of them shaking their heads. Rich Miller let out a short, derisive laugh. "Come on now, the tracks alone are worth that," the auctioneer cajoled. "Who'll start it at $50 for a 10-ton paperweight?" I raised a hand. 50. A low murmur went through the small crowd. Rich Miller's grin widened. He looked at his buddies and rolled his eyes, as if to say, "Look at the fool. I've got 50 from Jed Stone. Who'll give me 60? $60. The auctioneer scanned the faces. No one moved. $50 once, $50 twice. Sold for $50 to the man with more time than sense. The gavel cracked, and just like that, I owned a 10-ton problem. As the crowd dispersed, Rich walked up to me, shaking his head in mock pity. $50, Jed. I guess that's about what it's worth. What in God's name are you going to do with it? Let it rust in your fence row next to that old case combine of yours." I looked him square in the eye. "I'm going to get it running, Rich." He laughed out loud, a sharp, barking sound. "Running? Jed, you'd be better off setting a match to that $50 bill. You'll spend $1,000 trying to fix that thing, and you'll still just have a $1,000 piece of junk. But hey, it's your money to waste." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt like a nail being driven. "You keep playing with your toys. Some of us have real farming to do." He walked away, back toward the world of easy credit and shiny paint, leaving me alone with my prize. The sun beat down on the faded orange steel, and for a moment doubt crept in. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a fool, clinging to an outdated past while the world moved on without me. But then I remembered my father's hands, calloused and stained with the grease of 100 repairs, and his voice, firm and steady. "Son, the only thing you truly own is what you don't owe money on." Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. Take a moment and think about it. Have you ever saved something old from the scrap heap? A car, a tool, a piece of furniture that everyone else said was junk? Let me know in the comments what it was and why you saved it. I think there's a certain kind of person who sees value where others only see rust. Getting the HD6 home was the first battle. It took 2 days and a lot of favors. I had to hire Old Man Hemlock and his lowboy trailer, and we spent the better part of a morning just getting the Dozer winched up onto the deck. The tracks were frozen solid to the ground, and we had to use a heavy-duty jack and oak blocks to break them free 1 inch at a time. By the time we got it back to my farm and unloaded it next to the barn, I was out another $100, and the whole neighborhood had driven by to gawk. I could feel their judgment, their whispers carrying on the wind. There goes Jed Stone, dragging home more of his junk. My wife, Sarah, met me at the back door with a glass of iced tea. She had that worried look in her eyes, the one she got whenever I did something that didn't immediately make sense on a balance sheet. "Jed, what is that thing?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "It's an investment, honey," I said, taking a long drink. The cold tea was a blessing against the dust in my throat. "It looks like it's been through a war," she said, wiping a smudge of grease from my cheek with her thumb. "Rich Miller's wife, called Patty Henderson, said Rich told her you bought it for scrap. Is that true?" The gossip chain in a small farm community moved faster than a brush fire. "It was a good price," I hedged. "Jedediah," she said, using my full name, which meant she was serious. "We have fields to plow. The corn needs cultivating. You have that engine on the boiler you still need to rebuild. Are you sure you have time for a project like this?" I looked past her at the hulking orange machine sitting silently in the yard. It looked even bigger and more broken next to our modest barn. "Sarah, this is different. This machine, it can do things we can't. It can change the land. Dad always talked about terracing the back 40 to stop the erosion. He just never had the right machine. This is the right machine." She sighed, but she put her hand on my arm. "All right, Jed, I trust you. Just don't let it become an obsession. Don't let Rich Miller and his talk get under your skin." But it already had. That night, and for many nights after, I was out in the barn. The first order of business was the engine. I drained the oil and it came out like sludge. I pulled the filters. They were packed solid with dirt. The fuel tank had a good 2 inches of water and rust flakes in the bottom. I spent a week just cleaning. I flushed the fuel system, pulled the injectors and cleaned the tips, and took the cylinder head cover off to check the valve lash. The engine seemed sound mechanically, but the electrical system was a nightmare of cracked and brittle wires. The generator was shot, the regulator was a box of rust. I spent hours on the phone, calling parts dealers across 3 states. Most of them laughed when I said I needed parts for an HD6. "Son, we haven't seen one of those in 20 years, was the common refrain. But I finally found an old-timer in Wisconsin who had a salvage yard full of old Alice Chalmers crawlers. He had a used generator, a new old stock regulator, and a set of battery cables thick as my thumb. It cost me more than I paid for the whole machine, but I didn't have a choice. While I waited for the parts, I tackled the undercarriage. This was the real back-breaking work. The track tensioners were seized solid. I soaked them in penetrating oil for 3 days, and still they wouldn't budge. I ended up having to use my acetylene torch, heating the massive nuts cherry red until they finally surrendered to the persuasion of a 4-foot pipe wrench. I split the tracks, a dangerous job that involved driving out a master pin with a sledgehammer and a drift. With the tracks off, I could see the full extent of the wear. The rollers were frozen, the sprockets worn to sharp points. More calls to the man in Wisconsin, more money I didn't really have. Every evening, after a full day in the fields on my old farmall, I'd come back to the barn, eat a quick supper, and get back to work on the Dozer. I'd be out there until midnight, my world shrunk to the glow of a single trouble light, the smell of grease and diesel fuel filling my lungs. I learned every nut and bolt on that machine. I learned the particular groan the metal made when it was under stress, the satisfying thud of a bearing seating correctly. Meanwhile, the talk in town grew. Rich Miller made sure of it. At the grain elevator, he'd tell anyone who would listen about Jed's folly. He'd talk about how I was wasting the best farming years of my life, tinkering with junk while he was setting new yield records. And people listened because on the surface he was right. The price of corn hit $3 a bushel, something no one had ever dreamed of. Soybeans weren't far behind. Land that had sold for $500 an acre 2 years ago was now going for $1,500, and the banks were practically begging farmers to take out loans to buy it. One Saturday morning at the co-op, I was waiting in line to get a hydraulic hose made for the Dozer's lift cylinder when Rich came in. He was beaming. "Morning, Jed," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, still playing mechanic. "Just getting a hose made, Rich." "You know," he said, leaning against the counter, "I just closed on the old Henderson place, another 160 acres. Got a great interest rate from the bank, 5%. It's practically free money." He looked at the greasy hose in my hand. "You ought to think about it. You could trade in that old M of yours, get a real tractor, farm another 100 acres easy. You're just leaving money on the table." An older farmer in line ahead of me, a man named Gus, who'd known my father, turned around. "There's nothing wrong with that M, Rich. That tractor will be running long after your new one is in the scrapyard." Rich just chuckled. "That's old-timer talk, Gus. This is a new era. You've got to be aggressive. My accountant says with depreciation and investment tax credits, buying new equipment is the smartest thing a man can do." I just stayed quiet, paid for my hose, and left. But Rich's words echoed in my head. Was I being stubborn? Was I honoring my father's memory, or was I letting his fear of debt hold me back from a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? The pressure was immense. It felt like I was the only man in the county trying to swim against a tidal wave of easy money and optimism. The world was changing, and the early 1970s felt like a gold rush in the Corn Belt. The deal with the Soviets, what the newspapers were calling the Great Grain Robbery, had sent prices into the stratosphere. Every farmer I knew was living high on the hog. New pickups were in every driveway, wives were getting new kitchens, and Rich Miller was leading the parade. After buying the Henderson place, he bought another 80 acres that bordered my back 40. He took out a massive loan and bought a brand new Steiger Panther, one of those huge 4-wheel drive articulated tractors that looked like a monster next to my little farmall. He tore out all the old fence rows, filled in the grass waterways, and ploughed it all, right up to the property line. His farm was becoming a vast, unbroken sea of corn and soybeans. He was hailed as a genius, a progressive, the future of farming. And me, I was the village eccentric. By the spring of '73, I finally had the HD6 running. The first time that big six-cylinder diesel coughed to life, belching a cloud of black smoke that momentarily blotted out the sun, was one of the proudest moments of my life. The ground shook with its rumbling idle. The sound was raw, mechanical, and powerful. Sarah came running out of the house, a smile finally breaking through her worried expression. It was alive. But getting it running was one thing, putting it to work was another. I wasn't buying more land. I couldn't afford to, and frankly, I didn't want to take on that kind of debt. Instead, I started on the project my father had always dreamed of. My back 40 acres rolled down to a creek, and every spring a heavy rain would wash away tons of our best topsoil. It was getting worse every year. Using the old dozer, I started cutting terraces into the hillside. It was slow, painstaking work. I'd spend entire days on that machine, the diesel roaring, the steel tracks churning up the earth. I'd cut and fill, slowly shaping the land, creating long, gentle ridges that would catch the water and let it soak in instead of running off. I cleared out the scrub brush and invasive trees that were choking the creek bank, piling them up to be burned in the winter. I was healing my land, not expanding it. To my neighbors, it looked like I was playing in the dirt. Rich Miller would sometimes stop his big, air-conditioned Steiger on the hill overlooking my property and just watch. I could imagine his thoughts. Look at Stone, moving dirt from one spot to another while I'm planting another 100 acres of $3 corn. One afternoon, he drove his pickup down my lane. I shut down the dozer, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. "Jed, I've got to be honest with you," he said, getting out of his truck and walking over. He had to shout over the pinging of the cooling engine. "I don't get what you're doing." "I'm stopping erosion, Rich, saving my soil." "You're wasting the best commodity market in history," he exclaimed, waving his arm toward his own endless fields. "You should be planting, fence row to fence row. Every acre you have should be making you money right now, not being carved up into little ditches." "These aren't ditches, they're terraces. My yields on this piece of ground will be better in the long run. And I won't lose my farm to the creek." He shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "The long run. Jed, the long run is now. The Secretary of Agriculture himself said we need to plant to the limit. We're feeding the world. You're thinking too small. You're living in the past." He looked at the dozer, a film of dust covering its already faded paint. "Still proud of your $50 toy?" "It does the job," I said, my jaw tight. "Sure it does. A job that isn't making you any money." He got back in his truck. "Well, don't say I didn't try to warn you. When you're ready to join the 20th century, let me know. The bank's still lending." He drove off in a cloud of dust, leaving me standing there next to my loud, old, paid-for machine. For a couple of years, it seemed like Rich was right. He was making a fortune. He built a new house, a big ranch-style place on a hill. He put up massive new grain bins. His operation was the model of modern efficiency. My operation, by contrast, looked stagnant. I was making a decent living, my yields were steady, and I was slowly improving the land I already owned. I had no debt, but I had no new paint either. At church, at the co-op, I could feel the change in how people looked at me. I wasn't just Jed Stone, the hard-working young farmer. I was Jed Stone, the guy who wouldn't get with the times, the guy who was afraid to take a risk, the guy who was getting left behind. Even Sarah started to have her doubts. One evening she sat at the kitchen table with the account books open. "Jed," she said softly, "the Millers just bought a new boat. Patty was telling me they're going to the Lake of the Ozarks for a week." "We can't afford a boat, Sarah." "I know," she said, her voice small. "It's just, are you sure we're doing the right thing? Everyone else seems to be doing so well. It feels like we're standing still." I knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "We're building on rock, not on sand. All this boom, it doesn't feel real. It can't last." But as 1974 turned into 1975 and then 76, it seemed like it would last forever. Inflation was taking off, sure, but that just meant the land you bought last year was worth 20% more this year. Debt was an asset, not a liability. Or so they said. I kept my head down. I finished the terraces on the back 40. Using the dozer, I cleared out a half-dozen old, overgrown fence rows on my own property. the ones choked with hedge apple and wild plum, gaining myself another 10 acres of tillable ground without buying an inch. I used it to dig a new pond. The machine was slow, it was loud, and it broke down regularly, but I knew how to fix it. It was mine. Then, one evening late in the decade, I was listening to the radio in the barn. Paul Harvey was on, telling us the rest of the story. After his broadcast, the news came on. It wasn't about crop prices or cattle futures, it was about interest rates. The Federal Reserve, trying to fight runaway inflation, was jacking up the prime rate. The announcer's voice was grim as he talked about numbers I'd never heard before. 15%, 18%. He mentioned that variable rate loans, the very kind the farm banks had been pushing for years, were about to reset. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I shut off the radio and walked outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Across the valley, I could see the lights of Rich Miller's farm. His big new grain dryer was running, its fan whining into the twilight. He had hundreds of thousands of bushels of corn stored in those new bins, all of it financed. He had hundreds of acres of land, all of it financed. He had a fleet of new equipment, all of it financed, and all of it was on a variable rate loan. I looked back at my own modest farmstead, the old barn my grandfather built, the house that was paid for, the tractors that were old but owned outright. And sitting there, silent and solid in the fading light, was the old Alice Chalmers Dozer. It looked less like a piece of junk now and more like a slumbering guardian. The world was celebrating, drunk on a decade of prosperity, but out here in the quiet of my own debt-free land, I could hear the first distant rumble of a terrible storm. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the party was about to end. The summer of 1980 arrived not with a gentle warmth, but with the searing breath of a blast furnace. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, and the sun became a merciless eye in the heavens. Day after day, it baked the fields of Henderson County, cracking the black soil into a mosaic of deep fissures. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high and dark green, was stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward during the day as if in prayer for a rain that never came. The air was so dry it felt like you could strike a match on it. This was when the first real cracks began to show, not just in the earth, but in the new world Rich Miller had built. His vast, unsheltered fields were the most vulnerable. With no fence rows or grass waterways to hold the soil, the hot winds began to lift the precious topsoil, sending it swirling in great brown clouds that blotted out the sun. What little rain we did get came in violent, short-lived thunderstorms. On my terraced hillsides, the water was slowed, captured and held, soaking deep into the ground. On Rich's land, it hit the baked earth and ran off in torrents, carving deep gullies into his fields and carrying away his soil and expensive fertilizer into the creek. His big modern machines, designed for perfect conditions, began to falter. The dust, fine as flour, worked its way into everything. It clogged air filters, fouled fuel injectors, and overheated hydraulic systems. One afternoon in late July, I was working on my own baler when I saw Rich's massive Steiger Panther sitting dead in the middle of his field, a plume of black smoke staining the sky above it. I drove my old pickup over. Rich was standing beside the enormous tractor, his face streaked with sweat and grime, his hands on his hips in a posture of pure defeat. "What's the trouble?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Final drive," he spat, kicking one of the huge tires. Something went in the planetary hub, sounded like a bag of rocks in a coffee grinder, then she just locked up solid. I whistled softly. That was a catastrophic failure. "You call the dealer?" "Yeah," he said bitterly. "They can't get a mechanic out here for a week. And the parts, they have to come from the factory. Might be a month. A month. And they want $12,000 for the parts and labor." He laughed, a ragged, humorless sound. 12 grand. That's more than my dad paid for his first 80 acres. He looked over at my farm, at the green swales of my terraced fields, which had held onto their color far better than his. He didn't say anything, but I could see the question in his eyes. For the first time, it wasn't pity or condescension, it was a flicker of something else. Doubt. The news from the bank was worse than the weather. The letters started arriving in mailboxes all over the county. They were plain white envelopes, but they felt heavier than lead. Inside, cold, hard type explained that due to the Federal Reserve's actions, variable interest rates on operating notes and mortgages were being adjusted. Rich's 5% free money was about to become 18%, then 20%. The numbers were unthinkable, a death sentence on paper. The talk at the co-op changed. No one spoke of new tractors or lake houses anymore. The conversations were hushed, grim. Men who had been farming for 30 years looked haunted, their faces etched with a fear I recognized from my father's stories of the Great Depression. They were land-rich and cash-poor, trapped in a vice of falling crop prices, withered yields, and crushing interest rates. The grain embargo against the Soviets had slammed the lid on the export market, and the price of corn plummeted to below what it cost to grow it. Rich Miller, with his massive grain bins full of corn he'd held back hoping for a better price, was trapped. He couldn't sell without taking a staggering loss, but he couldn't afford to keep it while the interest on his operating loan compounded daily. The first farm auction was the Thompson place, south of town. It wasn't a retirement sale, it was a foreclosure. The mood was funereal. Neighbors stood in silent clusters, their hats in their hands, as the auctioneer sold off a lifetime of work piece by piece. The bankers were there, men in suits who looked uncomfortable and out of place, their clipboards holding the fates of families. Rich was there. He stood near the back, his arms crossed, his face pale. He looked thinner, older. The cocksure confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, hunted look. He watched as a John Deere 4840, barely 2 years old, sold for half what Thompson had paid for it. The machinery, once a symbol of prosperity, was now just a glut on the market. There were too many sellers and not enough buyers. That winter was long and bleak. The snow covered the dead fields, a white blanket over a buried dream. More auction notices appeared in the weekly paper. The Miller name wasn't among them, not yet, but the rumors were flying. People said the bank had given him 90 days. 90 days to come up with an amount of money that was simply impossible. His empire, built on the sand of easy credit, was being washed away by a tide of economic reality. One frigid afternoon in February, I was in my workshop rebuilding the carburetor on my old Farmall. The door creaked open, letting in a swirl of snow. It was Rich. He didn't look at me, just stood there, stamping the snow from his boots. "Jed," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "That old Dozer of yours, you still got it?" "It's in the shed," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. The lane back to my house. The snow's drifted 10 feet deep. The plow truck can't get through. My wife, she needs to get to town for her mother. The old lady's sick. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were hollow. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to. I could pay you." "Don't worry about paying me, Rich," I said, pulling on my heavy coat. "Let's go get her started." It took some doing. The old diesel was cold-blooded. I had to plug in the block heater for an hour and give it a little whiff of ether, but soon the HD6 roared to life, its exhaust echoing off the steel walls of the machine shed. I drove it out into the swirling snow, the steel tracks crunching and squealing. It was slow and clumsy on the frozen ground, but it was unstoppable. I followed Rich's pickup down the road to his long, winding driveway. The drifts were just as he'd said, monumental waves of white that had buried his lane completely. For 2 hours I worked, the Dozer's engine at a steady roar. I pushed walls of snow higher than the cab, clearing a path inch by painful inch. The machine was a brute, its 10 tons of steel a force of nature against the storm. When I was done, a clean, wide path led all the way up to his big, new, cold-looking house. Rich's wife came out, her face a mixture of relief and surprise. She thanked me, her voice trembling slightly. Rich just stood there by his truck, watching the Dozer idle, its exhaust puffing rhythmically in the frigid air. I was wrong about that machine, Jed," he said, not looking at me. "I was wrong about a lot of things." He turned and walked back to his house without another word. I didn't need him to say anything more. In the silence of that winter afternoon, with the rumble of my $50 Dozer filling the air, I knew the world had finally, irrevocably, turned upside down. The official notice appeared in the paper 2 months later. A public auction, by order of the Farm Credit Bank. The entire Miller farming operation. 200 acres of land, the house, the bins, and a full line of late-model equipment. The day of the sale was grey and cold for April, a perfect match for the mood of the crowd. It seemed the whole county had turned out, not with the feverish excitement of the auction 8 years prior, but with a somber sense of duty to bear witness to a tragedy. The auctioneer stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice lacking its usual rhythmic charm. It was strained, subdued. He started with the small items, tools, shop equipment, pickup trucks. They sold for pennies on the dollar. Then came the big machinery. The Steiger Panther, its final drive newly repaired at a cost Rich couldn't bear, sold for less than a third of its original price. The massive International Harvester combines, the 12-row planter, the chisel plows, each one represented a nail in the coffin of Rich's dream, hammered home by the crack of the gavel. I stood with Sarah near the back of the crowd. I wasn't there to gloat or to pick over the bones. I was there for one reason. Rich and his family were standing near the house, a tight, miserable knot of people. He looked like a ghost, his face ashen, his eyes vacant. He was watching his life being dismantled piece by piece. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the land. He sold it off in parcels. The 160 acres from the Henderson place, the 80 that bordered my back 40. The prices were heartbreakingly low, but they were all that the remaining farmers, themselves wounded and bleeding, could afford. The last parcel to be sold was the original Miller homestead, the 160 acres his grandfather had settled, the piece of ground where Rich had been born and raised, where his big new house now stood. "All right, folks, here it is," the auctioneer said, his voice heavy. "The home quarter. 160 acres more or less, with a house, barns and grain storage. A fine piece of ground. What am I bid?" The bidding started low. A few of the older farmers, men who had known Rich's father, made half-hearted bids, as if trying to prop up the price out of respect. It stalled at an amount that was barely enough to cover the mortgage on the house itself. The banker standing next to the auctioneer looked grim. He was about to signal to the auctioneer to close the bidding, to take possession of the land for the bank. In that moment of heavy silence, I looked at Rich. He had his arm around his wife, who was crying silently. His son, a boy of about 10, was staring at the ground, kicking at a loose stone. They were about to be homeless, cast out from the only life they had ever known. I thought of my father. Oh, no man. But he also taught me something else. Be a good neighbor. I raised my hand. "I have a new bid." The auctioneer's voice boomed, a spark of life returning to it. He looked out, surprised to see it was me. He announced the price, a figure that was fair, a figure I had carefully calculated, a figure that would satisfy the bank's note on that specific parcel. It was nearly all the savings Sarah and I had scraped together over 10 years of frugal living. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes wide, but she didn't say a word. She trusted me. A murmur went through the crowd. The banker nodded slowly. He knew it was a fair price. "Do I hear another bid?" the auctioneer called out. Silence. Going once, going twice. He looked around one last time. "Sold, to Jedediah Stone." The gavel fell, and the sound echoed across the silent farmyard. It wasn't a sound of victory, it was a sound of finality. The auction was over. Rich Miller's empire was gone. People began to disperse, talking in low voices, climbing into their pickups. I walked over to Rich. He stood stiffly as I approached, his eyes avoiding mine. "Jed," he started, his voice cracking, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I said quietly. "Listen to me, Rich. I don't want your house. I don't want your land." He looked at me then, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. "I want a tenant," I said. "I need someone to farm that ground, someone who knows it better than anyone. The rent will be fair, a share of the crop, just like in the old days. It'll be enough for you to live on, to get back on your feet. You and your family can stay in the house. No one is kicking you out." For a long moment, he just stared at me. The hard lines on his face seemed to melt away, and his eyes filled with tears. This man who had once mocked me, who had pitied my old-fashioned ways, was utterly broken. And in that moment, there was no rivalry, no history of slights or condescension. There were only two farmers, two neighbors, standing on the wounded earth. He nodded slowly, unable to speak. He reached out and shook my hand. His grip was firm, the grip of a man who, despite everything, still knew how to work. It was the first time we had ever truly shaken hands. The years that followed were lean, but they were healing years. The 1980s farm crisis scoured the Midwest, taking many good families with it, but it also taught a hard lesson. The gospel of get bigger or get out fell silent. In its place, a quieter wisdom began to take root, the kind of wisdom my father had preached all along. It was about sustainability, not just of the soil but of the finances. Rich became my tenant, and in time, my friend. Freed from the crushing weight of debt, he rediscovered his love for the land. He started farming his old home quarter with a smaller, older set of equipment he'd managed to buy for cash. We'd help each other during planting and harvest, his knowledge of the new seed varieties complementing my knowledge of mechanics. We'd sit at his kitchen table, drinking coffee, talking about the weather and the markets, not as rivals, but as partners in the precarious business of working the land. He became a humbler, happier man. My own farm thrived. The terraces and conservation work I had done with the old Dozer paid dividends. My soil held water better, my yields were more consistent, and my input costs were a fraction of what they had once been for my neighbors. The HD6 became a local legend. I used it to help other neighbors clear ditches, build ponds, and remove old concrete foundations. It was no longer Jed's folly. It was a symbol of a different way of thinking. Years later, in the early 90s, my son David was a teenager, full of the same fire and ambition I'd had at his age. He was fascinated by the new tractors with their computerized controls and GPS guidance. One sunny afternoon, he found me in the old machine shed, standing beside the HD6. It rarely worked anymore, but I could never bring myself to sell it. Its orange paint was almost completely gone, faded to a soft, blotchy pink. But its steel heart was still strong. "Dad," David said, running his hand over the massive, cold blade, "why do you keep this old thing? It's ancient. It just takes up space." I smiled and put my hand on his shoulder. "This machine," I said, my voice resonating in the quiet shed, "is the most important tool we own. It taught me the difference between what something costs and what it's worth." I told him the whole story. I told him about the auction in '72, about Rich Miller's mockery, about the long nights spent bringing it back to life. I told him about the drought, the foreclosure, and the day I cleared Rich's lane of snow. "You see," I said, looking him in the eye, "Rich wasn't a bad man. He just got caught up in the fever. Everyone was telling him he was a genius for borrowing all that money, for getting bigger. It's easy to believe you're a genius when you're making money, but the money wasn't real. It was just debt." I patted the Dozer's fender. "This was real. I paid $50 for it. I put a couple thousand into fixing it. But it was mine. No banker could ever come and take it away. When the storm came, and it always comes, this machine was my anchor. It didn't just save our farm, David, it helped save our neighbor." He was quiet for a long time, his eyes tracing the old welds and grease stains on the machine. He was looking at it differently now, not as a heap of obsolete iron, but as a piece of our history, a testament to a hard-won truth. "The world will always try to sell you something new and shiny," I told him. "It'll promise you an easier way, a faster profit. And sometimes that's true. But never forget the value of what you own outright. Never bet more than you can afford to lose. And never, ever be too proud to get your hands dirty fixing what's broken." I looked out the wide door of the shed, across my fields. The land was green and healthy, the terraces my father had dreamed of holding the soil in a gentle embrace. Rich's farm, next door, was smaller but just as neat and well tended. The sun was warm on my face, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree by the barn. I hadn't become the biggest farmer in the county, I hadn't gotten rich, but I had survived. I had built something that would last, something I could pass on to my son, a legacy not of acres or dollars, but of wisdom. And in the quiet contentment of that afternoon, I knew that was worth more than all the shiny new tractors in the world.